Shivering German Shepherd with her pups, this man's decision will warm your heart. The wind howled through the barren trees, their branches bending and creaking under the weight of ice. Snowflakes swirled in frantic patterns, carried by the unforgiving storm, and the world outside was nothing but a blur of white. The small wooden cabin, nestled deep in the wilderness, barely stood against the relentless winter. Its old walls groaned under the force of the wind, as if whispering a warning to the man inside. Ethan sat in his worn-out armchair, the soft crackling of the fire the only comfort against the storm's fury. The flames flickered, casting restless shadows across the cabin's modest interior. Wooden shelves lined with books, an old radio that barely worked, and a heavy woolen blanket draped over the couch. This was his world now. Quiet, predictable, isolated. Just the way he preferred. Tasty-mus. He wrapped his calloused hands around a steaming cup of tea, breathing in its warmth. Outside nature raged in full force, but in here it was peaceful, safe. Then a sound broke the stillness, a faint scratching at the door. Ethan froze. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. His first instinct was to dismiss. The storm had likely dislodged a branch, or maybe the wind was rattling something against the wood. He took another slow sip, forcing himself to ignore it. But then, a whimper. Soft, fragile, desperate. His grip on the cup tightened. He set it down on the side table, his heartbeat suddenly louder than the storm. A stray animal, perhaps? A fox caught in the cold? Or something worse? For a long moment, he didn't move. Ethan wasn't the kind of man who went looking for trouble. He had learned through painful experience that helping others often came at a cost, and yet something about that sound made it impossible to turn away. Another whimper, this time weaker. His chest tightened. Slowly, he rose to his feet, each step toward the door feeling heavier than the last. The wind rattled the windows, urging him to stay inside, to mind his own business. But his gut told him otherwise. He reached for the doorknob but hesitated. There were dangers in the wilderness, even beyond the cold. Wolves roamed these parts, though they rarely approached humans. A wounded animal could be unpredictable, even deadly. His fingers hovered over the lock. The storm howled louder, as if daring him to take the risk. Finally, he took a breath and turned the handle. The door groaned as it opened, and a blast of icy wind rushed inside, biting at his skin. Snow swirled in, blurring his vision, but then he saw them. A German shepherd trembling violently, her fur matted with snow, and beside her, two tiny puppies, barely able to stand. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The mother dog lifted her head, her deep brown eyes locking onto his, pleading, desperate, afraid. She stood protectively over her pups, shielding them from the cold as best as she could, but she was losing the battle. The puppies whimpered, their small bodies pressed against their mother for warmth, their fragile legs quivering. Ethan's heart pounded. They won't survive out here. He clenched his jaw, his mind warred with itself. Bringing them inside meant responsibility, something he had spent years avoiding. It meant warmth, safety, but also risk. They weren't his problem. He could close the door, walk away. But could he really live with that? The mother dog lowered her head slightly, as if sensing his hesitation. She didn't move forward, didn't force her way in. She waited, trusting him to make the decision. A lump formed in Ethan's throat. The puppies let out another soft cry, their tiny bodies barely able to hold on to life. The wind howled, the cold pressed in. And then Ethan exhaled sharply, stepping aside. "Come in." The German shepherd hesitated for only a moment before gently nudging her pups forward. They stumbled across the threshold, their small paws meeting the wooden floor with exhaustion. Their mother followed, her body visibly sagging, in relief. Ethan shut the door behind them, sealing out the storm. The warmth of the cabin washed over them, melting the ice clinging to their fur. The puppies collapsed onto the floor, too weak to move, and the mother dog curled protectively around them, her breathing heavy. Ethan stood there, staring down at them, his mind still catching up with what he had just done. His quiet, routine, life had just changed in an instant, and somehow he knew this was only the beginning. Ethan stood frozen in the open doorway, the wind biting at his skin, snow rushing past him in furious swirls. The German Shepherd didn't move. She stood, stiffly, her body trembling, thick fur dusted with frost. Her ears twitched, but her deep brown eyes stayed locked onto his, silent, desperate, pleading. Beside her, two tiny puppies shivered violently, their small bodies barely strong enough to stand. Their fur was damp from melted snow, their legs wobbly as they pressed against their mother for warmth. Ethan's fingers curled around the edge of the door. He should close it. It wasn't his problem. The storm howled louder, as if mocking his hesitation. The mother dog didn't push forward, didn't bark, didn't demand. She simply waited. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. A part of him wanted to reach out, to scoop them up and carry them inside, but another part, the part that had learned the hard way not to get attached, held him back. He had taken in a stray once before. Many years ago. Duke. The memory hit him like a punch to the gut. A scrappy, golden-furred mutt he had rescued as a boy. He'd loved that dog more than anything. They had been inseparable, exploring the woods together, racing through fields. Until one day Duke had disappeared. Ethan had searched for days, weeks, calling his name, leaving food out, hoping. But Duke never came back. The ache of that loss had never truly left him. And now here he was, staring at another dog in need. He clenched his jaw. Taking them in would mean caring. Caring would mean getting attached. And attachment always led to loss. The mother dog shifted slightly, her paws sinking deeper into the snow. She was waiting for his decision. Ethan exhaled sharply, looking past her into the storm. They wouldn't survive out here. Not in this. His mind protested. They might belong to someone, they might be sick, they might not even trust him. But then one of the puppies whimpered. A small broken sound, almost lost in the wind. Something in Ethan cracked. His body moved before his mind could argue. "Come on," he muttered, stepping back and holding the door open wider. The mother hesitated, scanning his face with cautious eyes. Then, as if sensing that this was their only chance, she nudged her puppies forward. They stumbled inside, their tiny paws slipping on the wooden floor, too weak to move much further. The mother followed, her tail low, her gaze still wary but filled with gratitude. Ethan shut the door behind them, sealing out the storm. Silence. Only the crackling of the fire remained, the warm glow casting flickering light on the trembling. Figures before him. The puppies collapsed onto the floor, their small chests rising and falling rapidly. The mother dog immediately curled around them, her body pressing close, shielding them from a cold that no longer reached them. Ethan stood, there unsure of what to do next. His cabin was small, bare. He hadn't shared this space with another living soul in years. And now here they were, 3 unexpected intruders huddled together, slowly melting the frost from their fur. He rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling. This wasn't part of the plan, he muttered, but his voice was softer now. The mother dog lifted her head at the sound, her ears perking slightly. Ethan crouched down, careful, slow. Up close, he could see how exhausted she was. Her ribs faintly visible beneath her thick coat, her fur tangled in places, the puppies barely more than bones and fluff. His chest tightened. How long had they been out there? Had she been wandering for days, searching for help? Had she knocked on other doors before reaching his? The puppies shuddered. Ethan moved without thinking, grabbing an old blanket from the couch. He knelt beside them, hesitated for a moment, then draped it carefully over the small family. The mother tensed, but didn't resist. A slow exhale escaped. Ethan's lips. He wasn't sure what he had just gotten himself into, but one thing was certain. There was no turning back now. The wind roared, shaking the cabin's walls, rattling the windows as snow whipped through the open doorway. The mother dog stood motionless, her paws sinking into the thin layer of snow that had crept inside. She waited, her dark eyes locked onto his, searching for an answer. Ethan felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His heart pounded. The puppies lay curled at his feet, their tiny bodies barely rising and falling, their fur damp and matted from the storm. One of them whimpered, a frail, broken sound. His breath caught. They wouldn't last much longer. The mother dog's tail flicked. She shifted slightly, glancing down at her pups before looking back up at him. She wouldn't move unless he allowed it. Ethan swallowed hard. Everything in him screamed to be careful, to think this through. Letting them in meant responsibility. It meant attachment. But what choice did he have? He clenched his jaw, then finally he exhaled. "All right, come in." The words were barely above a whisper, but they were enough. The mother dog sighed, a soft, relieved sound, almost human in its quiet gratitude. She nudged the first puppy forward with her nose, then the second. The tiny creatures stumbled inside, their legs weak, their breaths shallow. And then, as if the last of her strength had left her, she stepped in and collapsed onto the wooden floor. Ethan barely had time to react before the weight of the storm crashed back against the cabin. He grabbed the door and slammed it shut, sealing them inside. Silence. Only the wind howled beyond the walls, muffled and distant now. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the scent of burning wood. The golden glow of the fire flickered, casting shadows over the exhausted figures before him. Ethan turned. The mother dog lay still, her chest rising and falling in heavy, labored breaths. Her paws were raw, her fur tangled with ice. The puppies barely moved, curling instinctively into her warmth. He took a step forward, hesitated. She didn't flinch. Ethan knelt beside her, pressing his palm against the wooden floor. Up close, he could see the wear on her body, the silent battle she had fought just to make it here. How long had she been out there? How long had she been searching for safety? His throat tightened. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out. She watched him but didn't move away. His fingers brushed over, her fur cold, too cold. He withdrew quickly, moving to the old couch where a thick blanket lay draped over the backrest. He pulled it down and brought it to her. She tensed slightly as he laid it over her and the pups, but she didn't resist. Ethan sat back on his heels, running a hand down his face. What now? They were inside, safe for now. But then what? He had no dog food. He hadn't owned a pet in years. His life was simple, isolated. His chest tightened at the thought. But then, as if sensing his doubt, the mother dog shifted. She lifted her head slightly, peering at him through half-lidded eyes, trusting. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Ethan sighed. He pushed himself up and walked toward the small kitchen. His cabinets weren't stocked with much, but he could find something, anything. Behind him the fire crackled and the storm raged outside, and for the first time in a long, long time, he wasn't alone. Ethan moved quickly, his hands working with careful urgency. He grabbed the warmest blankets he could find from the small wooden chest by the fireplace, shaking off the dust, before kneeling beside the fragile puppies. Their tiny bodies were curled against their mother's side, barely stirring. Gently, he wrapped each one in a soft cocoon of warmth, his fingers brushing against their damp fur. The puppies whimpered faintly, instinctively snuggling deeper into the blankets. The mother dog watched. Her amber eyes followed his every movement, exhaustion clear in her face. She didn't flinch, but there was something else behind her gaze, caution. She had trusted him enough to step inside, enough to let him near her babies. But trust wasn't easy. Not after what she had been through. Ethan exhaled, keeping his movements slow, deliberate. "I won't hurt them," he murmured. She blinked, ears twitching slightly. Taking that as a good sign, he stood and hurried to the small kitchen. His supplies were limited, but he had milk. He warmed a bowl of it over the stove, testing the temperature with his finger before setting it down in front of the puppies. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, weakly, one of the puppies lifted its head. Its tiny nose twitched, catching the scent. A second later it nudged forward, its wobbly legs barely holding its weight. The first tentative lap was slow, uncertain, but then the second pup followed, and soon both were drinking. The mother dog let out a soft breath, her body relaxing, ever so slightly. Ethan felt it too. A quiet relief settled into the cabin, a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. He stepped back, giving them space. The storm outside raged on. Wind howled through the trees, rattling against the windows. But inside, something had shifted. For the first time since this night began, the mother dog let her guard down. Her body, stiff with tension, slowly melted into the blanket. Her breathing steadied. Her head dipped lower. Ethan hesitated, then lowered himself to the floor a few feet away. The flickering fire cast long shadows across the walls, its golden light dancing over the wooden floor. The room was silent, except for the occasional pop from the burning logs and the faint sound of the puppies nursing. The German Shepherd lifted her head slightly, gazing at him. Her eyes, once filled with uncertainty, held something else now, trust. Then, in a move that caught Ethan completely off guard, she shifted forward and rested her head against his knee. His breath hitched. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. The weight of her trust settled over him, heavier than anything he had expected. He swallowed hard. What had this dog been through? Carefully, he reached out, fingers brushing lightly over her matted fur. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He let out a slow breath. "You're safe now," he murmured. Her eyes closed. The night stretched on, the storm continuing its furious assault on the world outside. But inside, in this small, dimly lit cabin, something new had taken root, a bond, a quiet understanding. But just as Ethan was beginning to feel the weight of exhaustion settle over him, a thought struck him. Where had she come from? Was she abandoned, a stray? Or had someone been looking for her? His gaze dropped to her neck. A collar, worn, scratched. But there. His stomach twisted as he reached for it, his fingers brushing over the cold metal tag attached to it. He turned it over, and what he saw changed everything. Ethan's fingers trembled slightly as he turned the small metal tag over in his palm. The engraving was faded, barely legible beneath years of wear, but the name was still clear. Hope. His chest tightened. The irony of it hit him hard. This dog, abandoned, left to freeze in the brutal storm, still carried a name that spoke of survival, of something worth holding on to. Ethan swallowed, his gaze drifting back to the German Shepherd. She was curled protectively around her puppies, her body still tense, but her breathing had evened out. The puppies had stopped shivering, nestled safely against her warmth. He let out a slow breath. This dog had belonged to someone. At some point, she must have had a home, a family who cared enough to give her a name. But now, there was no address. No phone number, no way to know where she had come from. Had she been abandoned, lost, or had someone simply given up on her? Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He was not in the business of keeping pets. He lived alone, miles away from the nearest town, his world made up of routines and solitude, a quiet life. But, as he looked at Hope, saw the way she curled protectively around her pups, her ribs faintly visible beneath her fur, the way she had trusted him despite everything, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn his back on them now. A part of him told him to check the shelters, put up notices, try to find her original owner. But another deeper part of him whispered a different truth. What if there was no one looking for her? What if she had been waiting for someone to choose her, to fight for her, the way she had fought to keep her puppies alive? He glanced toward the window. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world buried in white. The wind had settled. The night was still. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the fire had chased away the cold, replacing it with something else. Something unspoken. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. He reached out slowly. Hope's ears twitched at the movement, but she didn't pull away. Her amber eyes met his, filled with something quiet, something fragile. He swallowed hard. This wasn't just about logic. It wasn't about what made sense or what fit into his carefully built world. Some choices weren't about reason. They were about heart. Ethan took a deep breath, then let his hand rest gently on her head. Her fur was rough beneath, his touch tangled from the storm, from weeks, maybe months of struggle. But beneath that there was strength, there was resilience. "You're home now," he whispered. For a second there was only silence. Then, slowly, hope lifted her head. She gazed at him for a long moment, then leaned forward and licked his hand, a small tentative gesture of trust. Ethan let out a shaky laugh, something tight in his chest finally loosening. Outside, the snow glowed softly beneath the moonlight. The storm had come and gone, leaving the world cold and quiet. But inside, something much warmer had just begun.